you for joining us for today's webinar, Police and Community Relations, Local and National Perspectives. My name is Adam Ash, and I am with the OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of moments to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect, which will help you maximize your opportunity to participate in today's webinar. To download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, locate the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. To send a chat message, type your message into the text box. Hit enter or click the message bubble icon to send. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. This will help us with our final count. Again, if you're viewing with a larger group, please type in the number of additional people joining you today. If you're watching alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. During that time, we will take every opportunity to address some of the questions you have posed during the presentation. Type your questions in the chat box as they arise. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be provided with a link to take a 5-minute online survey about today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. This information is used to assist in future planning and training. You'll also be able to access the evaluation link on the last slide of the PowerPoint. Finally, this event will be archived in OJJDP's online university at www.intac.org in approximately 3 weeks. You can also check out past webinars that have been archived on the online university. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Jerome Avoy from OJJDP for some brief opening remarks. Jerome?
Yes, thank you, and I would like to welcome everyone. Greetings from the snowy side of town here in Washington, D.C., in Maryland area. So we are so excited about the webinar today on community and police trust. We have lined up some great speakers, and we just look forward to continuing this conversation as we move forward with our T and TA initiatives. So I would like to now turn it over to Beth Zanjani with Development Services Group, who will outline some of our information around our TA and training. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome, and welcome everybody. I'd like to begin by just sharing a few things about DSG and then share a little bit about this Training and Technical Assistance webinar. DSG is an established national research training firm that develops research and practice activities, manages and dissemination of research-based findings, and providing criminal and justice-related training and technical assistance to local communities over the past 25 years. DSG's T&TA division conducts conferences, education, and training programs, distance learning, and web-based trainings. Technical assistance is provided in accordance with established competency-based standards and protocols. In many instances, DSG staff deliver TA and coordinate TA provision by drawing on a wide range of consultants in our network. DSG manages the Youth Violence Prevention and Training and Technical Assistance Project for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention by brokering and providing relevant and training and technical assistance to 39 jurisdictions through OJJDP's fund in 3 initiatives: the Defending Childhood Initiative, National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention, and the Community-Based Violence Prevention. This work aims to promote the well-being of children and youth, their families, and communities where they reside, and also to enhance public safety by preventing and reducing violence. Under this cooperative agreement, DSG works closely with OJJDP, the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Partnerships, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Department of Education, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Housing and Urban Development. In this effort, DSG employs strategic coordinated T&TA to OJJDP's youth violence prevention grantees and helps them plan, implement, and sustain the youth violence prevention work and provides a range of high-quality, cost-effective training and technical assistance. Today's seminar is a part of an ongoing strategy as a part of our cooperative agreement with OJJDP in the area of youth violence prevention. It concludes a 2-month focus on the issue of police-community trust. In addition to this webinar, we also, in partnership with OJJDP, will be launching a community of practice. And this community of practice will be engaging law enforcement officials from all around the country on the issue of a whole range of issues, from police training, staff evaluation, de-escalation, building community trust, and links to prevention activities. This community of practice, we feel, would be a very important conversation given the national importance of this very sensitive issue. We are pleased and privileged to host today's webinar on this topic, and we're very excited about the participants and the caliber of participants that we have and presenters. With that, I'd like to introduce our two co-moderators who will be facilitating this conversation, and we'll be doing a wonderful job in really probing in some of these questions and some of the topics that will be addressed. Our first co-moderator is a dear friend, Jack Calhoun, who's a strategic advisor to DSG. He's also an internationally renowned public speaker and served as a senior consultant to the U.S. Department of Justice for its Youth Violence Prevention TTA project for the last several years. He's also the author of The Untold Story of How Faith Works in America Through the Hourglass, Poems of Life and Love. In 1979, President Carter appointed him to the post of U.S. Commissioner for the Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, overseeing such programs as Head Start, foster care, and adoption. He helped write the landmark Child Welfare and Adoption Act of 1980. He also helped create the Office for Families and Office for Domestic Violence, and served as the Vice President for Child Welfare League of America in 1983. Mr. Calhoun testified before city councils, county commissioners, state legislatures, and Congress. He's also been a frequent media guest and has listed in Who's Who in America and the world. Jack's credentials and academic background are, he's got a BA from Brown University, a master's degree in theology from Episcopal Divinity School, and a master's degree with honors in Harvard School of Government. Catherine McQuay is a senior advisor for the director of the COPS office, which is the Office of Community-Oriented Policing in the Department of Justice. She also serves as the acting supervisor of Police Practices and Accountability Initiative. In that role, Ms. McQuay oversees COPS Collaborative Reform Initiative, the Critical Response Program, and the implementation of the recommendations of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Under the Collaborative Reform Initiative, the COPS office works to improve trust between police agencies and communities they serve by working with law enforcement, community members, and other stakeholders on organizational transformational issues around a range of issues. As a part of COPS' continued work on the task force recommendation, the office is supporting national efforts to implement the recommendations, working to provide meaningful solutions to help law enforcement agencies and communities strengthening trust, collaboration, while they're ushering in the nation into the next phase of community policing. So with that, I turn over the mic to our distinguished co-moderators to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Bass. Thank you, Jerome. A hearty welcome to everyone from across the country. We're broadcasting live from D.C., a.k.a. Nome, Alaska, with 30 inches of snow, but we're warm, and thanks to the wonders of electronics, we have 4 amazing presenters, one of whom got here by dog sled. Thank you, Catherine, the COPS office. Heartfelt thanks to you, Jerome, and Justice and DSG for making public and wrestling with what is probably the most contentious issue in criminal justice today, police-community trust. Attesting to the importance of this issue in the public mind is the fact that there are 1,000 people on the phone today. I see these names popping up: Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland. So welcome. Today we will address such issues as: to whom are the police accountable? What is their role? Protector? Warrior? Both? What's the community's role for the co-production of safety? How well do the police know their communities? How do we ensure mutual accountability and transparency? How are police trained, evaluated, promoted? And what's the federal government doing? These are but a few of the difficult questions with which they will wrestle. We could not have a better quartet today, friends. They are up to the task. They have top posts, and most important, they're pioneers. They're really on the forefront of this. So after my quick introduction, each of the panelists will speak. Catherine will speak briefly, and then she and I will co-moderate, and then each of the other three panelists will speak for no more than 20 minutes, leaving hopefully about 30 minutes for you. Send your questions in. There are a lot of you, so we'll batch them, get the most consistent questions out there. Fast summary, quick scorecard so you know what's coming. Catherine, as Bass mentioned, Senior Advisor to Justice and is on top of the 21st century policing for the government. Chief Frank Straub will speak about the department he took over in Spokane, Washington, a department riven with mistrust. Tracy Kersey directs the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice and will reflect on the challenges and opportunities facing those attempting to enhance police community trust across the country. Susan Lee will speak on the Urban Peace Institute's stunning work in Los Angeles, in Watts, where crime plummeted and where both the police and the community changed. Catherine, you have been introduced by Bass fulsomely. Welcome, dear friend and colleague. What's the national thrust, Catherine?
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for sending the dog sled. It was well worth the effort to be here. We have so much good information to hear. I'll just make this brief, but as far as the national perspective is concerned, I did want to say a few words about the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which hopefully many of you know about, but you can find out everything you ever wanted to know about it and more by checking out our website at www.cops.usdoj.gov and clicking on the Task Force button. The task force was charged with examining a broad range of issues facing policing today, identifying best practices, and then making recommendations on how to promote effective crime reduction, at the same time building public trust. We know that in a democratic society, trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve is essential, both to the stability of communities and to the integrity of our criminal justice system. And we know that the fear of oppression and discriminatory law enforcement can be as debilitating to a community as the fear of crime can be. The task force ended up with 59 recommendations and hundreds of action steps, and now the real work is taking place with many, many law enforcement agencies across the country, as well as various components throughout the Department of Justice working to implement those recommendations. The recommendations were built around 6 pillars, and I will just focus on the first one, which is building trust and legitimacy. One recommendation calls on the law enforcement profession to embrace a guardian mindset versus a warrior mindset in order to build public trust and legitimacy. The report talks a lot about changing the culture of an agency because we all know that culture will trump policy every time. The task force also recommended that law enforcement agencies acknowledge the role of policing in past and present injustices and discrimination and how that can be a real barrier to the promotion of community trust. The report recommends that agencies adopt procedural justice as a guiding principle for agencies in both their external and their internal policies and practices, because we know how officers are treated within their agency will say a lot about how they in turn interact with the community. And agencies are encouraged to engage in fair and impartial police training, which examines the unconscious biases that we all have. The report stresses the need for law enforcement agencies to work together with community members, especially those neighborhoods disproportionately affected by crime, to develop policies and strategies and to make it a collaborative, transparent process where you're truly working together with the community. The report talks about the need for greater diversity in recruitment, hiring, and promotion. And it talks about the need for different training, such as an emphasis on crisis intervention or CIT training, which helps officers better deal with individuals in crisis or suffering from mental disabilities, as well as the need for de-escalation training, which we have all read about recently. The members of the task force believe that the recommendations laid out in the report, if followed, can really bring about long-term change to law enforcement agencies, and in the process build strong, mutually respectful relationships with those agencies and the communities they serve. And we have been so pleased to see the number of agencies already putting these recommendations into practice. I also want to say just a few words about one of the major efforts underway at the COPS office to help transform law enforcement agencies, and it's called the Collaborative Reform Initiative. Collaborative reform provides a middle ground between a formal consent decree from the Civil Rights Division and smaller-scale technical assistance efforts to help departments. The program is designed to improve trust between agencies and the communities they serve by promoting organizational transformation. This is done through an analysis of policies, practices, training, tactics, and accountability methods all around specific issues within a department, all of which are strongly linked to the task force report. This is a voluntary process on the part of the agency, but the agency must demonstrate a commitment to address the recommendations and to undertake significant reform efforts, and we have the court of public opinion to back us up on those efforts. Collaborative reform is not a short-term fix, but it's a long-term strategy that first identifies issues within an agency that might affect public trust, and then offers recommendations based on that comprehensive agency assessment. To date, we've engaged in this process in Las Vegas, Cannes, Philadelphia, St. Louis County, Fayetteville, Salinas, Calexico, and we have just begun work in Milwaukee. Las Vegas has completed the process and has made considerable progress in changing its policies, tactics, and training concerning the use of deadly force, and the number of officer-involved shootings is down dramatically. And in Philadelphia, similar changes are underway, and again, a substantial drop in the number of use of force incidents and officer-involved shootings has been recorded, and there's also been a commitment to transparency by the department, and more information than ever is now being shared with the community. And Chief Frank Straub, who we'll hear from shortly, can attest to the changes in the Spokane Police Department following our collaborative reform work there. So I will stop and turn it back to Jack and look forward to the discussion.
Catherine, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Quick question before we move on to Frank. There are a lot of people on the call, and I think the assumption is often the federal government's here and the federal government has money. Tell us about how some sites might access, as you said, small-scale TA, the collaborative reform, which sounds so promising, and whether there is any other resources they can access.
Sure. There are a few things. Collaborative reform is designed not just to help the agency we're working with, but to help agencies across the country. So if you go online, you can see our reports on Las Vegas, on Spokane, on Philadelphia, and we find agencies are taking those recommendations, taking those action steps, and implementing them in their own agencies. You can also contact our office if you'd like to be considered for collaborative reform. And OJP, the Office of Justice Programs, has the Diagnostic Center, which is a great way that agencies can get technical assistance for their departments.
Great. Just one final note quickly. I know we've all heard the term. Give us a very succinct definition of procedural justice, because that's one of your biggies.
Sure. Procedural justice means how I am being treated. So if I perceive that I am being treated fairly and respectfully, it's going to make a big difference in how I then treat the people I work with. And one of the examples we always give is if I am pulled over by an officer for speeding, if I am treated respectfully, if I'm told why I'm being pulled over, if I have a dialogue with the officer, even if I get a ticket, I'm going to feel differently about that interaction than if I were not treated in that same way.
Beautiful. Yeah, I know that in the 90s in Boston with Reverend Rivers and Brown, there was police shooting, but because of the trust there, it did not blow up. It just wound up in a dialogue. Frank, we turn to you. 30-year veteran of law enforcement, former chief in Spokane, where Frank Straub reduced serious crime and the use of force and expanded community policing initiatives. He served as public safety director in Annapolis, which included police, fire, and homeland security, deputy commissioner of training for the New York City Police Departments, and he's held many federal posts. He holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD. Frank, welcome. What did you inherit, and what did you change?
Well, good morning, good afternoon to all the participants, and thank you very much, Jack. You know, I've been very lucky. I've had the privilege of leading 3 police departments in my career, White Plains, New York, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, and Spokane. As you mentioned, I'm currently, as of January, the Senior Law Enforcement Project Manager for the Police Foundation in Washington, D.C. What I want to focus on is how, through these 3 cities, I have endeavored, working with a team of incredible professionals in each of the cities, to improve community relations, to rebuild community trust, to move those departments, and I think in some ways the profession of policing forward. And I'll get to Spokane towards the end of my presentation. I want to just familiarize our participants a little bit with the Police Foundation. It was established in 1970 through a Ford Foundation endowment. It's an independent, nonpartisan, and non-membership organization which is dedicated to improving policing through innovation and science. The Foundation collaborates with law enforcement, other government agencies, academic institutions, and other organizations to conduct research and provide training and technical assistance to advance policing. One of the critical areas of the Police Foundation, and one that really drew my interest and brought me to the Police Foundation, was their interest in juvenile justice. The Foundation recognizes that by building and sustaining meaningful youth-police relations, contacts with the criminal justice system can be significantly reduced. One of the programs that the Police Foundation is currently involved in is with California law enforcement. The Foundation developed a partnership with the California Endowment, the California Police Chiefs Association, and California State Sheriff's Association. That partnership focuses on community policing and evidence-based strategies for policing today's youth. It includes issues briefs that provide information on school-based police officers, the Teen Brain and Public Safety Career Pipeline programs. Dissemination of this program is to begin in February of this year, and products will be available through the Police Foundation website. Let me begin a little bit about where we've come in terms of my career and the impact that I think I have had and the incredible teams that I've worked with have had. My first department that I was really truly the leader of was in White Plains, New York, which is about 30 miles north of the Bronx. I got involved in youth violence and prevention and intervention as a result of a gang-related homicide and subsequent acts of retaliation, most of which took part in our downtown. The downtown at the time was a burgeoning area with new restaurants and bars and theaters opening up, and it caused quite a crisis in many ways in the city, and raised a lot of concerns about our youth and youth violence. The first program we created was the Youth and Police Initiative, commonly referred to as YPI. That program was developed in collaboration with the North American Family Institute, NAFI. Over the course of a week, at-risk youth met with police officers assigned to the neighborhoods in which they live. During YPI sessions, teens and police officers discussed community challenges, the role of law enforcement, stereotypes, and barriers to effective communication. The goal of the program is to break the cycle of mutual distrust that frequently exists between young people and police officers. Community and faith leaders, school officials, the courts, and police officers referred teens for participation in YPI. They then stayed and acted as role models and mentors during and after the sessions. They also became invaluable contacts for police officers in the community. Many of our YPI participants moved into the Step Up program, which in collaboration with the city's Youth Bureau provided wraparound counseling, employment, education, and other services to our teens. In addition to YPI and Step Up, our police officer mental health team responded to all incidents in which children were exposed to violence or traumatic injury. During the period 2002 to 2010, all 210 of the White Plains police officers and more than 200 at-risk youth participated in YPI. The program and our accomplishments in reducing youth-involved violence and improving community relations were the subject of my congressional testimony in 2008. Before I go to Indianapolis, I just want to share one anecdote from White Plains. In one of our sessions, we had police officers that were assigned to our public housing complex, which had 5 15-story buildings, about 1,000 families living in them. And he was sitting across from a young man, and the young man looked at the officer and said, "I have a question for you. How come every time you see me, you chase me?" And the police officer said, "Well, how come every time you see me, you run from me?" Well, as they started to talk, what they found out is that the training officer for the police officer had told him, when you see somebody running in public housing, they must have done something wrong, so you should chase them. The young man had learned from his parents, who had learned from his grandparents, and when you see the police in public housing, you run from them because they're going to do something bad. And what came from that discussion is the realization that for generations, police officers had been chasing people in the public housing complexes, and people had been running, and sometimes for no reason whatsoever. And probably one of the most valuable pieces of YPI was getting everybody to stop running and stop chasing each other. And while the program was geared at young people and improving police-youth relations, what we found is not just in a public housing complex, but in all the neighborhoods in which we implemented YPI, we saw not only improved police community relations, but we also saw police-youth relations improve. We saw violence go down, as Jack mentioned, by 40%. So that was my White Plains experience in a very quick synopsis. I then had the privilege of going to Indianapolis, Indiana. One of the signature programs during my tenure was we worked with Eskenazi Medical Center, the city's main trauma facility, and we assigned a team of police officers to the Prescription for Hope program. The Prescription for Hope program engages teens and adult victims of violence during their hospital stay with the goal of ending their participation in violent activity and stopping retaliation. We also implemented YPI in each of our 6 police precincts. We implemented ceasefire in most of our violent neighborhoods. We expanded our Explorer, Cadet, and other programs. And I truly believe that as a result of these programs and other community interventions, we reduced homicides to the lowest level in 20 years. I became the chief in Spokane, Washington in 2012. To just backtrack a little bit, in 2006, a Spokane police officer encountered an individual by the name of Otto Zam in a convenience store. Mr. Zam was a mentally challenged individual, and we're never going to be quite sure of what happened and why the interaction went south, so to speak. But Mr. Zam apparently failed to comply with the police officer's directions. A struggle ensued, a use of force by the police officer. The department and Mr. Zam died as a result of this interaction. And over the course of 6 years, from 2006 to 2012, there was tremendous amounts of community distrust. There was community dissatisfaction with the police department. And in 2012, the officer was convicted of making false statements and obstruction of justice. At his sentencing, approximately 50 police officers stood at attention in the courtroom and saluted the officer as he was led from the courtroom and into incarceration. This is the department that I inherited. We did, as Catherine mentioned, begin a collaborative reform process with the Department of Justice, which has been tremendously successful. We also implemented all 26 of a local use of force commission's recommendations. In the course of my 3 years there, we reduced officer use of force by 22%. Again, I turn to youth as the way to build and restore relationships with the community. So we had the internal changes we made, we had collaborative reform, we had the Spokane Use of Force Commission, and then we had a series of programs in Spokane which I believe have been tremendously successful. Since beginning YPI in 2013, 200 teams and 80 police officers participated in the program. YPI became a catalyst for other programs, the Police Athletic League, Restore Our Kids, and the Faith and Community Leaders Alliance. In 2 years after we started, the Police Athletic League grew from 50 participants in one city neighborhood to 150 last year citywide. Restore Our Kids uses YPI participation as an alternative to out-of-school suspension. The Faith and Community Leaders Alliance was established with key ministers, school officials, and community leaders who had participated in YPI, as well as the Police Athletic League. That alliance provides open communication between the Spokane PD and the community in terms of critical incident response and information sharing. In each of the cities that I had the privilege of leading and working with such talented men and women in the department as well as in the community, we implemented a series of programs to repair fractured relationships among police, youth, and the community. These programs reduced youth violence, diverted young people from the criminal justice system, and repaired severely damaged community policing relationships. As a member of the Police Foundation's team, I look forward to working with all of you if the opportunity arises to further the tremendous efforts being made across the country to improve relationships among our youth, our police departments, and the community. Thank you.
Frank, terrific job. This is Jack. Motif running through it was your Youth and Police program, which you did at a number of cities. So 2 quick clarification questions, and thanks for ending a little bit early for more questions. One is, where do they get information on that? Either that and or your congressional testimony. And just a second question on that is, give us a little policy on why you began with youth in each of your cities. So first, where do we get the info? Second, why did you begin with youth?
So there's a few places one could go for the information. Certainly SpokanePolice.org. There will be information there on the Youth Police Initiative, our Restore Our Kids program, the diversion program, as well as our Sports Athletic League. Lieutenant Tracy Michael runs those programs, so if somebody wanted to get in touch with Tracy directly, I would highly recommend that. You could also go to the North American Family Institute, NAFI, their website. There's information there about YPI, not just in Spokane and Indianapolis and White Plains, but their efforts to implement it in police departments throughout the country. My congressional testimony is available online, and I had the privilege of speaking at the White House about 4 months ago, and if one was to go to the White House website on community policing or the DOJ COPS office website, they'd be able to find information regarding my testimony as well as the tremendous testimony of many of my colleagues. Mm-hmm. Why start with youth? youth are the future of this country. And I think if we pay attention to our young people, we also get the attention of their parents, their guardians, and community members at large. Because everybody has this keen interest, right, in seeing our young people be successful, seeing our young people diverted from the criminal justice system. And so that has always been, and I think I learned the lesson in White Plains, the catalyst for change. I also found it to be the catalyst for change in police culture. That when we started YPI in White Plains, we specifically picked the police officers that were doing the hardcore street-level enforcement in public housing, for example. These were the women and men that were chasing young people around. These were the women and men who were confronting some very difficult individuals in our community, some heavily criminally involved people in our community. And what we saw is they came into these YPI sessions with their arms crossed and, I don't really want to be here. I got better things to do. I'm not a social worker. Back then, I'm not a guardian. I'm a warrior. My job is to lock up bad guys and to fight crime. What we found by the end of the YPI sessions is people were not folding their arms, rather they were embracing the young people. The young people who came in with the, I don't want to deal with the po-po attitude, were now talking to police officers. And interestingly enough, we started getting young people and their parents and their guardians and just associates who would start showing up at YPI just to watch the dynamic. And it really became a catalyst for change inside the police department, among our youth, and inside the broader community. And we had really open, honest, frank conversations about what police officers thought about the young people and what the young people thought about the police officers. That expanded into the adults and older teams that would participate. And I think that if I look back on my years from White Plains going forward, that open, honest exchange around stereotypes, perceptions, procedural justice, police legitimacy was the game changer.
Frank, thank you. That's really lovely, and I think maybe the older I get, but a lot of policy can boil down to some very simple things. The conversation, youth, parents, and just that wonderful phrase, stop the running, which was really graphic. That was really lovely. Thank you very, very much. We're going to move now to Tracy, but Susan or Tracy, did you want a quick comment or question before we roll on to Frank? Okay. Tracy Kesey, Dr. Tracy Kesey, directs a national initiative for building community trust and justice, a DOJ project led by the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College. Project aims to improve relations and increase trust between minority communities and the criminal justice system. Tracy's a 25-year veteran, having served as captain of the Denver Police Department, where she also helped to run the Colorado Information Analysis Center. She has long promoted transparency and accountability. She holds a BA, an MA, and from the University of Denver, a PhD. Tracy, welcome. What challenges and hope are you seeing nationally?
Good afternoon, and thank you. Just before I answer that question, let me do this. In the document section, for those folks that have joined us, will be some things for you to take away regarding the national initiative. So there's one sheet on implicit bias, reconciliation, and as well as procedural justice. So I want to make sure that you get that. When we're talking about the national initiative that was so well sort of rounded out for us, I'm going to be going through these slides rather quickly because I really want to get to the conversation at hand about what are those challenges that we're seeing and what are some of the things that we're doing to overcome. So I think importantly to understand is when this initiative came together was under Attorney General Eric Holder. And this was really around the time frame post-Trayvon Martin, for those that, if you remember, the young man with the hoodie. And so one of the questions that was really happening on the ground for those of us who do research and those of us who are in law enforcement, we're really trying to think about what are those next steps? What are those things that we should be doing, and what should we be talking about in regards to how do we get not just law enforcement to focus on the issues at hand, but the community as well, but then to have them both come together and to work towards some type of mutual understanding and some agreements in regards to how do we not just co-produce criminal justice, but how do we move forward. So that's really the space in which all of this was created. You'll see on your screen, these are our participating DOJ components. They are a very heavy partner within the national initiative. As was always mentioned, our national initiative partners are listed for you there as well. These are the folks, so these are what I consider to be the brain trust around these areas in which we are going to be doing our work in 6 cities, and how do we really focus on not just building trust, but how do we also talk about capturing that and sharing that information, not just with the 6 cities, but with those of you who are in on this specific webinar. The national initiative itself is built on 3 pillars, and you've heard a couple of these already discussed when we talk about procedural justice, we talk about implicit bias, and we talk about reconciliation. So the work in which we are really shaping in 6 of our cities have these 3 lenses in all of the work that we do. And the reason why we chose these 3 lenses is because they directly really attach themselves to the issues at hand on the ground, and specifically to communities of color. So when we're talking about implicit bias, unconscious bias, as some of you may really refer that to, describes that automatic association that people make between groups of people. They're stereotypes. It's the way the mind makes a quick link, a shortcut. So for example, one of the most salient shortcuts that's often made in law enforcement is young black males in crime. So you will get that sort of feeding back into what Frank was saying about why do folks run, but why do we perceive people running? So that's another way of looking at that as well. Procedural justice, which was briefly talked about in regards to not just the way that we interact with the public, but how the characteristics of those interactions shape the public's view and thus affects our legitimacy as law enforcement. So those are, again, another key pillar there. Reconciliation is a space in which we have to kind of reframe the narrative. And often when you think about reconciliation, you think about South Africa, or you think about those very substantive sort of endpoints where you have to go back and reconcile. Reconciliation in the national initiative process is not just how do you bring folks together to talk about the historical issues that have occurred, but how do you capture those narratives? But they also take different forms. Really small, substantial steps of reconciliation could also look like in the form of amnesty for warrants, for low-level warrants. I think a lot of folks have been hearing about that work, where you have some courts have come and said, you know, all these tickets that we have written on, you know, marijuana, small amounts, they really do more harm than good, because once we pile up all of the fines and we keep folks from getting driver's licenses and they can't go to work, so we start to see this really just streaming of things that are happening in this space. The additional components of the national initiative are the group violence intervention. This is where some of our youth work is done. Our subpopulations, as you can read for yourselves there, youth, of course, being one of those, but also you do see other communities that are listed as well, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges. These are our pilot sites. The pilot sites were chosen not because they had a significant history with issues with community, but one, because their chiefs were forward-thinking, their communities were ready to begin this type of work, and the officers were somewhat on the fence, and we'll talk a little bit about that too when we talk about challenges. But all in all, what we needed to do is make sure we could find 6 very diverse departments, not only in their makeup and size, but also in the communities that they serve. So those were sort of critical pieces for all of us in doing that. One of the things that I saw is already kind of popped up in the chat section of this is trustandjustice.org. If you don't remember anything that I say today, remember trustandjustice.org. This is a space in which you'll be able to go and look at the implementation plans for all 6 of our cities, as well as all of the work we'll be doing over the next 3 years around this space of trust and how do you build those relationships. So I want to make sure that you have that. My contact information is here, and I'm just going to leave that up for a bit as we talk a little bit about some of the challenges. So one of the things that I have the utmost pleasure of doing is with these 6 cities, we can kind of get off of the ground and sort of pull back to a bird's eye view of this. And when we talk about, Frank was talking about why he chose to do juveniles, one of the things that we have to look at from a law enforcement perspective and organization is that, of course, juveniles are one component of the specific, communities, depending on community, but also really is an indicator that there are other issues that are often beyond law enforcement. So when we talk about challenges, one of the challenges that we often have when we're doing these types of programs, and which we find in some of our 6 cities, is that sometimes some of these issues that are coming to forefront are not law enforcement related issues. And historically, chiefs have been very, very hesitant to even speak that. And so oftentimes when we have issues that are around jobs, that are around education, that are around housing, although they all share the framework of historical racial issues that are baked into those structures, some of these sort of positions that are happening around law enforcement are really not laying at the feet of law enforcement, but oftentimes will, because we are open 24/7. So we are often that sort of frontline group that is really challenged with addressing all of those issues that are coming or that we're facing as we move across the strait. So some of the challenges that are happening, not just nationally, but with the national initiative itself, is the space of trauma. And I want to say that one of the things that really has not been discussed, and for those of you who are on, who are listening in, who are of the background of social work and social psychology, is the issue of trauma. One of the challenges that we have is that not only do we have communities that have been traumatized by historical interactions with law enforcement, we also have groups and departments of law enforcement officers who are also going through that same sort of traumatic experience. Sometimes it's vicarious through another organization. So for an example, I'll date myself. When Rodney King first happened, if those of you who are still on the job and old enough to remember this, when you made a traffic stop, typically some kind of comment was made towards you about "don't beat me like Rodney King." It's those types of experiences and exposures as well to law enforcement that we find ourselves really having to put to the forefront that we often don't talk about. And that's typically can be a challenge when you are talking about going into an organization and trying to do some of these innovative things that you're hearing today. We have to be mindful of the community and the landscapes within law enforcement that we're dealing with, and oftentimes we don't stop to think about those things. So when I look at those challenges, I look at challenges in 2 ways. I look at challenges, one, on the individual group level, and then I also look at challenges of folks that share the same challenges. And in this space, the challenge that both community and law enforcement share is that trauma, is how do you attend to the trauma around events that have been happening. And typically what you will hear officers say is that, I understand what happened in Ferguson or what happened in Baltimore, but it didn't happen here and it wasn't me. So those are sort of that spaces that we really have to begin to address if we really want to get down on the ground and start making sure these things are not only being effective, but we also have to talk about sustainability. Because a lot of times when we go in and we are very good at getting partnerships and making sure that we are reducing crimes and building those relationships, but in some cases these things aren't sustainable. And we have to think about what are the barriers and the challenges that keep us not only from sustainability, but also keep us from implementation and moving these things forward. Another challenge that we often find in doing this work as well is that it really falls in the realm of our reconciliation pieces, is that you have 2 groups of folks or multiple groups and communities of folks that do have historical perspectives that have not been answered to. And I think a lot of you will also, this will sound familiar to you when you're talking to officers and you're talking to, folks in the academy, and they'll say, well, that was then, that has nothing to do with me now. And so we really have a lot of conversations around how do you pull that thread through the history and help officers understand why it's so relevant today. And sometimes that's the hardest part when we are talking about how do we manage that relationship and how do we give transparency, but how do we also help folks understand what's happening and what's going on. Our other challenges, and this is the last one, I promise you I'm going to get to some hope here. Some of our other challenges, too, are around the readiness of the organizations and the officers, right? Some officers, again, and some community members, but some officers will tell you, we don't know how we got to this space. I've been merely doing what I've been told to do over the last 5, 10, or 20 years or the last 6 months, and yet now I find myself defending my actions when I'm actually doing what my sergeant or what this plan happened to be for the day. So we have that space as well, is how do we get everybody to sort of this center point where we can begin to really talk about not just the issues of implicit bias and reconciliation, but how do we talk about procedural justice in a way in which we both recognize not only does it keep officers safe and the community safe, but it is a way for us to move forward from some of this history. When we talk about what is out there and what's on the horizons, there's so many things that are going to be helpful in breaking down these challenges that we see. You're going to hear, of course, a few of those today, a few of those programs that are in place. But also, some of those hopes for us is the fact that we're having the conversation, that there are over 500 of you now that are listening to this conversation and are beginning to understand a little bit more about what the larger conversation has been about, and hopefully really starting to put pieces together about what types of things do we do to move forward. And I think there was a Q&A that had popped up about, you know, where do we find these programs in our own cities or other related programs? And that's great questions. Those are the things that you should be exploring because, believe me, they're out there. We're in 6 different cities, and one of the things that we always have to be mindful to on the ground is that you have folks doing the work. You just have to go out and find them. That's a part of doing your relationship building. That's a part of your own trust building. But it's really a part of knowing what your barriers and your boundaries are. There are things that we can recognize as law enforcement officers that need to be done, or service providers in criminal justice that need to be done, but we might not necessarily be the folks to get them done. So we also have to be very mindful about that, but we also have those folks on the ground that are ready and more than willing to help move those spaces forward. Probably one of the bigger things for me as far as how do we sort of get through these barrier pieces is all of the resources that are available. I mean, you hear some of them. You hear NTTAC, you hear the COPS office. There have been numerous times where I have been with chiefs and with command staff and with officers and field training officers who are not aware of the resources available and the work that's already been done in a lot of these areas. You really need to avail yourself to this. So some of it may be there is a lot of reading that may happen. Sometimes it's just as easy as picking up the phone and calling one of your closest peers in the next county to find out what they're doing. But for us in the national initiative, all of these things that will be happening with us, so whether it's training, whether it's research, whether it's what we call unique interventions that are specific to communities, all of those things are going to be made available to share. But more importantly, I think for us, when we talk about how do we do these things on the ground, that you need to have a really good understanding of your community, of those relationships, of the history, so you don't do any additional harm, but you have the ability to move forward. So I think I answered your question sort of in a roundabout way, but I wanted to sort of leave some time for discussion. So.
Tracy, thank you. That was really wonderful, and welcome to your post. John Jay's really out in front on this one. A couple of quick questions. I recall Tony Armstrong, chief in Memphis, who just said it is so hard to get beyond the screaming. He said, as chief, when I walk into a meeting, I'm just stealing myself. I'm going to be yelled at for 10 minutes. How do you get beyond that first tidal wave of hostility? I guess my real question is, what are some of the elemental steps the police can ask of the community? I mean, we have procedural justice, which is tough. It is training.
There is
so.
education. But tell me just something that a law enforcement personnel, a chief, precinct captain, whatever, can say, look, can we at least start here? Whether it's having dinner with your, I don't know what it is, but just some fundamental needs that they can, a police department or an individual can ask without getting creamed, without getting a tidal wave of hostility.
Well, sometimes I think most of us in this business know that you're going to get screamed and you're going to get a tidal wave of hostility. The real question is, how long do you want that to go on? I think that everyone has a healthy respect for allowing certainly communities to have voice, equally to have, for officers to have voice. But really the chief, the command officers, the officers really have to begin to set the tone in just saying, I hear you. I recognize that, what has happened historically. A lot of times those are huge steps that never occur because somehow folks think that that's a way of having to apologize or to admit fault. But to simply acknowledge the fact that these things have happened or they have occurred, but you're willing to move forward and to have these conversations. The reality on the ground is you're going to get folks who are going to be willing and ready to move forward, and you're going to have others who are going to be stuck in that same space because it's somehow it's a comfort piece for them because it requires some internal change and some internal reflection. Or you have some folks, that if we've been doing this for a long time, this is sort of their gig. This is what they do. They are the folks that go in and make sure that, things are stirred up. But as far as, leaders and folks on the ground trying to build community capacity, you really need to make sure you're partnering with good facilitators, that you have a good framework and a good strategy about what you would like to do. But those things have to be informed by the community. Oftentimes, law enforcement really gets ahead of ourselves because we don't like that uncomfortable getting hashed down and yelled at, so we really want to get to 10 before we go, to 2, 3, 4, and 5. But there is a process for moving forward, and there are a lot of people on the ground in a lot of the cities that I have saw sort of coming up on my screen that have people who can do that for you. But I think as a police leader, or even if you're a police officer, really the first step is to acknowledge the fact that you hear what is being said, and that you are here and you're willing to begin further conversations so we can find a way forward. It's not easy. It's not anything that's going to happen overnight. That's called a relationship. And it's something, though, that if you're committed to, you will have the ability to overcome.
What's the role of the faith community in that? In lay terms, a lot of them are honest brokers, and theologically stated they can be reconcilers, where they're getting yelled at by the community, calling them sellouts or whatever, and by the police, because I know in a number of cities with which I've been working, faith community has played a key role. Now, some of them are out in the streets picketing, but many have taken the reconciliation role. Do you have any opinion on the role of the faith community in this?
Well, the faith community, still continues to be the sort of go-to community you can go to. But also there are some challenges with the faith community as we talk about generationally. Where are we going with, all that's happening? But, this is not to say that you cannot go there. This is not to say that you cannot have those conversations, and you're absolutely correct. They, a lot of times, can help you frame what's going on and often can take off of you sort of that, hashing or that thrashing, but it doesn't mean that you step away and allow them to do that alone. That means that is a partner that you stand with and that you allow them to maybe be that mediator to help you move forward.
Catherine.
And Tracy, you said what a lot of our folks are commenting on via the chat room, and that's the piece that, yes, there is going to be anger and yelling and shouting, and that piece is important, I think, is what you're saying, and it has to be heard and acknowledged before you can move on. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. There's no way around that.
And somebody else in the chat room, I just wanted to give a plug. They mentioned a program that we have called Coffee with the Cop, and it's caught on throughout the country, but it's really, it sounds simplistic, but it's working. It's officers who go to McDonald's, you can do Starbucks, you can do whatever, and they put flyers up, and community members sit down and talk to officers, and it's as simple and basic as that. But I think when you have two people sitting across the table and you realize that you are just two people sitting across the table, you'd be surprised at how much can be accomplished.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One final question before we move on. And Tracy, this is wonderful. We talk about the police chief and the senior officials. What is the role of the mayor in all of this?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, I think one of the roles of the mayor, depending on where you are and how your chiefs are selected, of course, they are going to either be really the chief safety officer or they are the ones that select the chief. But it's really important for the mayor to have also a really good understanding about what's happening on the ground in those communities. And so I'm not saying just from a electoral standpoint, but really having an understanding between what law enforcement is experiencing, what community is experiencing, and then assisting the chief on how do we begin to move forward, not only as individual communities, but as a city. So I think that also is that space in which the mayor can really sort of help step in those spaces where it's not law enforcement related, and you'll hear a lot of conversations around CIT or critical incident training, which is important, but equally important is having enough beds for folks to be admitted to. And those are things on a sort of citywide administrative policy level that the mayor could be bringing to the table while the chief is really focusing on these other areas.
Great. Okay, thanks again. We turn to Susan. Susan Lee, Executive Director of the Urban Peace Institute, and was the architect and implementer of the stunningly successful initiative in Watts that reduced crime, increased trust, and institutionalized changes in the LAPD. Author, professor, former director of nonprofits, holding degrees in both economics and law, pursuing a PhD in ethnic studies, and her scholarship has been recognized through numerous fellowships and awards. Susan, welcome. Some view what went on in Watts as a miracle. Give us a taste of what went into that miracle.
Thank you, Jag. I appreciate the opportunity to share the LA story. Before I start, I wanted to just point you to some documents on the document section of the webinar. There is a one-pager about the Urban Peace Institute. We were, for 15 years, a very successful program of a national organization advancement project. This year, last year actually, we're in our first year as an independent organization. A lot of our track record happened in those 10 years, including the transformation of LA, which we are architects and advocates for, that I will talk about today. And we have also trained over 2,500 law enforcement and street outreach and gang intervention workers, and have engaged with over 22 communities. But that one pager can tell you more about our mission and our areas of focus. There's a second document called the President's Task Force CSP, which is the Community Safety Partnership Program that I will be focusing on today. And that document will tell you much more in detail kind of how it came about, what its strategic framework is, and where it's going, what its accomplishments are, what the challenges are. So I did want to point that out. I wanted to really start with the LA context because I do believe the Community Safety Partnership, which is a relationship-based policing model that we are piloting in LA as a partnership between Urban Peace Institute, LAPD, and the Housing Authority, was really possible because of a broader context of transformations that were going on in LA. And you're going to hear a lot of the messages that Tracy and Frank have talked about before me, and those kind of messages will resonate in this context. And so one of the biggest changes really was the consent decree in LAPD after both the Rodney King incident as well as the Rampart crash scandal in 2002. And as a result of that consent decree and the change in leadership, the then former Chief Bill Bratton came in 2002, and now we have Chief Charlie Back. Both through Chief Bratton and Chief Back, we have been on this journey of cultural transformation. I think Catherine talked about cultural transformation really always trumping policy change, and that is what has happened in LAPD. And so there could be, this CSP model of relationship-based policing would not be possible were we not having that trajectory of change since 2002. Another important marker in Los Angeles context is in 2007, a call to action report was released by the Urban Peace Institute, which we were commissioned by the city to look at how the city was handling violence, particularly gang violence in LA. And what we found was a dismal record of wasting money on 2% solutions and not a strategy that could be actually deployed in the highest need communities. And as a result of that report, the city of LA went through a systems change in how they approached community violence. They established an accountability structure called the Mayor's Gang Reduction and Youth Development Office and employed a comprehensive approach in high-need communities, 14 high-need communities initially, and now we are up to 23 high-need communities in LA. If anyone knows the geography of LA, it is a 456 square mile, 4 million people city. Every neighborhood is diverse and different from each other, and so each of these communities are receiving a tailored, comprehensive approach with very similar elements around prevention, intervention. By intervention, I mean street outreach or gang intervention, and coordination with law enforcement. And now we are really introducing and going robustly with this relationship-based policing model as the next step in this comprehensive approach. Part of why I think we've been able to sustain it since this time of 2007 and onward is because we've had tremendous success with this approach. As you can see in this slide, 42% reduction in gang-related crime, 52% reduction in shots fired, a lot of which has to do with this parallel training and coordination between law enforcement and gang intervention and or street outreach, who both respond to every shooting that occurs in the city of LA. 48% reduction in assault with a deadly weapon on an officer, very important stat for me and for officers particularly, because we know from this stat that this approach and the relationship-based policing approach that I will talk about is protective of officer wellness and safety. And so officers can feel better about working in partnership with the community. And then 48% reduction in gang activity by youth being served through the prevention programs. And so one of the things that I did really want to point out, because I noticed in the chat box, and absolutely correct, is this notion that everybody has, all hands on deck approach has to be the way to go. It can't just be law enforcement, it can't just be faith-based leaders, it can't just be the city. It does have to be this very comprehensive approach that brings together all assets in the community together and really lift up the voices of both informal and formal leaders in our community to be able to get a handle on achieving safety. The background to this particular program, which is what we call relationship-based policing, is that in 2010, Urban Peace Institute was commissioned by the Housing Authority to do a violence assessment of one of the housing developments in Watts. And what we found there was an improved situation from the late 80s and 90s, where about 90% of the housing development was controlled by the entrenched gang dynamics. What we did find, however, is that gangs were still in control of that housing development, and particularly the newer Spanish-speaking Latino residents lived with fear every day, and that their everyday function was being impeded by gang activity. Close to 60% of the Latino residents of this housing development reported that they could not sit outside on their own porch because of the fear of gang violence. Ironically, on the day that this report was released, there was what we call a welcome wagon incident at Jordan Downs, which was an immigrant family was moving in, and they were robbed at gunpoint without even being able to take their possessions off of the truck, and the women of the family were marched upstairs and would have experienced a gang rape had the neighbors not intervened. That welcome wagon incident really galvanized us to broker a partnership between the Housing Authority and LAPD, and to help develop initially a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, for a 5-year deployment of officers to 4 housing developments throughout the city. And now we have 6 housing developments in this project. and that each of the officers would be deployed for 5 years and would be specially recruited and specially trained to be in this, what we call the relationship-based policing unit or the community safety partnership. Prior to deployment, the officers received 100+ hours of training, a big bulk of which was done by the Urban Peace Institute around relationship-based policing, improved communication, de-escalation tactics, mediation, conflict resolution, typically the things that they would not get from the academy training. This is a map of the neighborhood in Watts particularly that we're looking at. Each of those colored boxes are gang territories. You see the yellow box, Jordan High, and so anyone from that area walking to that school would have to walk through this gang neighborhood in order to be able to get there. This is the saturation of gang activity that is going on in Watts that we were attempting to address through this relationship-based policing approach. The basic tenets of relationship-based policing is very much like what Tracy talked about. It is the belief that community safety is possible when there is authentic trust between law enforcement and community, and that community trust comes about through procedural justice, police legitimacy, and authentic and sustained relationships. And I want to emphasize the importance of authentic and sustained relationship. We believe that relationship-based policing has to have right incentives for officers. So all the officers who were recruited and became members of the Community Safety Partnership Unit were promoted as part of that transition. They were required to stay in that position to keep that promotion. And there was geographic accountability for each of them. So officers were specifically assigned to particular housing development and surrounding neighborhoods. There was a mandate by the Memorandum of Understanding for officers to build relationships with community stakeholders through a variety of non-traditional police activities, including safe passages to and from school, youth programming, community events. So some of the things that officers have done is mentoring, being in schools. They've also developed a football team, a Girl Scouts troop. You name it, these officers have been creative in building these non-traditional police activities to engage the community, particularly the young people and their families. Again, I want to emphasize the importance of training, how these officers received specific training that they would not get in academy, and so it was about enhanced communication skills, the idea of collaboration and being part of a comprehensive strategy rather than sort of law enforcement being the sole player in a safety strategy. De-escalation skills, very important. We recently just completed a training of officers around understanding trauma among young people and how to de-escalate, what are the appropriate skills for them to avoid arrest of young people. And so the trainings are ongoing. I think we've had 4 trainings over the last 5 years with these particular community safety partnership officers. And then again, this coordination across sectors. So it's not just about LAPD, it's also about the Housing Authority and their policies. Are they promoting safety? It's also about schools. Are they concerned about student safety to and from school and on campus, parks, and definitely service providers and local leadership in that neighborhood. And this final point is really important. I think that when we finally came to kind of the aha moment on this project is when law enforcement understood that they were partners in achieving better community level outcomes and not just crime reduction. But it was important that law enforcement also valued that the young people in that community have better educational outcomes, that community perceives that they are more safe, that there are more green spaces, and so the better community outcome is what brings the community and LAPD together towards a single mission to work together. Safety being obviously the most important one and the threshold community outcome, but all these other ones just as important, especially the young people outcomes. What is CSP? There are now 65 officers deployed to 6 housing developments. We are also contemplating expanding into 2 additional neighborhoods that are not housing development based. there's joint financial responsibility between Housing Authority and LAPD. Again, specially recruited, promoted, and trained, and a 5-year commitment from the officers. And each housing development team, which consists of a sergeant and 10 officers, are broken out into 4 smaller teams, taking over community affairs, schools, critical enforcement, and youth programming. And I think one of the things that really resonated with me when Tracy and Frank were talking about is this notion of reconciliation. These officers are trained to do reconciliation not just on a monthly basis or at a special meeting, but that every opportunity of contact that they have with the community be one of reconciliation. One of the hardest things that these officers have trouble with when I'm training them is this idea that they must take ownership over the history of LAPD's hostility with the community. Why should I do that? These are 20-something-year-old officers who weren't even around when Rodney King or Crash happened. And so it is very hard for them to accept that because of the uniform they wear and because of the badge that they have to the community, that they must be the bearers of that legacy and be willing to accept that history and apologize at times for that history of hostility and wrongdoing that might have happened. The track record is phenomenal. I have to say, even as an architect of this program, I did not anticipate the level of success that we might have. In that first 18 months of implementation, we had a 70% drop in violent crime. We're still maintaining a 69% drop in homicides over the last 4 years in the 4 housing developments. We are, and this is all the while reducing juvenile arrests by 50%, which has gone a long way to improving community perception of LAPD because of the reductions in arrests that we see. I could kind of go on and give you lots of anecdotes of the success, some really surprising ones, and we have some preliminary assessment data that's come forward, very encouraging in terms of how really that community perception of safety has changed, but also how the relationship between law enforcement, LAPD, and community stakeholders have transformed in many ways. So I can do that, but I do want to touch on these challenges, and my time is running out. So Urban Peace Institute is concerned not just about program implementation. We do program implementation to demonstrate that transformation is possible, but our ultimate goal is systems change. And so the challenge we have, the things that we are now working on is how do we institutionalize the lessons learned from community safety partnership as it is even expanding continuously. We now have a second unit called Community Relationship Division that is 100 officers going down the same road. And so how do you institutionalize lessons learned in terms of creating motives and incentives for officers to go down this path? How do you institutionalize the training, so on and so forth? Officer burnout is a huge challenge with this approach. It is a much harder approach than regular policing, and so there's definitely a balancing that's required. And then officers struggle with the push and pull between conducting enforcement activities when necessary versus their mandate to relationship build. And I can talk more about that. I do want to give some time for question and answer. And then finally, these communities are changing dynamically from moment to moment. What used to be a predominantly African-American community, now it is 72% Latino residents. And so navigating the subcultures of that community, I would say LAPD has done a lot better with the African-American community and has probably much longer way to go with the Latino community in Watts, for example. So I will end there, and thank you for the opportunity again.
Susan, thank you. That is awesome and so exciting, and thanks for your candor about how transformation, which is huge among police department and the community, gets institutionalized. I want to turn it over to my co-moderator for a minute, Catherine, then we'll come back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Jack. And we've gotten a lot of questions on the chat room. If the information in the chat room will be available when the call is over, it will not because of privacy regulations. So I would suggest anyone who's interested, cut and paste right now what's up there, put it into a Word document so you have it, because we've been watching it. There is great information, great resources up there. So again, I would cut and paste right now if you're interested in retaining that. Also, Susan, we have a question. If you could repeat your email address for folks.
Absolutely. It is slee, S-L-E-E, @urbanpeaceinstitute.org. And that one-pager on that document will have both my phone number and my email address on that one-pager.
And I also saw a question about the website I mentioned for the COPS office. It's cops.usdoj.gov, and you can have a host of resources there. Also ojp.gov, a host of resources, and the one Tracy gave, the Trust and Justice. You'll find so much information on all of those.
A quick question here, and then Tracy and Frank, I want you also to chime in on reflections on what each of you has said and what Susan's gone over. But just quickly, Susan, this took a lot of money, is my guess. What would you suggest for how the departments who may not have less or may not have the access can get started on this? Or check my assumption first that it did take a hefty chunk of change.
There was definitely a financial component of this. The Housing Authority provided the funds for the promotional upgrades, some overtime and some programming dollars. However, LAPD obviously provided the base salaries of the 65 now officers that are in this pilot project. I believe that the more important than the money is about readiness. I've had lots of calls from different jurisdictions since Ferguson and other places incidents have happened, and I don't find every department is ready for this approach for a lot of reasons, not the least of which leadership and political will from mayor and other elected leaders to support such an approach, because crisis will happen, and when crisis happens, that political will has to be willing to support for the sustainability of this approach. And so I would say readiness is more important than the resources.
Can the private philanthropic or business community help with readiness? I mean, a foundation's not going to pay for salaries, but can they help start the conversation? Have you seen the catalytic role of the philanthropic community in this?
Absolutely. So in LA, the California Endowment, the California Wellness Foundation, and other, Weingart Foundation, all have contributed to this approach in terms of things that, for example, they will support our training. They may also support the idea of convening to bring community and law enforcement together, policy reviews, and so we do a lot of police policy reviews, and that obviously takes time. I'm an attorney. We have other attorneys on our team, so time, labor is part of kind of what philanthropic opportunities. But really, the goal is for this to become part of the system's own approach, and eventually become part of how they allocate their own public resources toward this approach.
Thank you. Catherine.
And Frank, we had a couple questions. One, how folks can find programs like the ones you talked about in their own cities and towns, and especially how we can find access to those programs in small towns, small communities that aren't connected to urban areas.
Yeah, as you know, Catherine, because you spent some time with me in White Plains, there's a relatively small community, only 60,000 residents. I think Jack hit on it earlier. Keep it simple. You hit on it, Catherine, when you talked about the coffee with cops. What we really have to do is get people to sit down and to engage with each other and just have frank and honest conversations. It's interesting. I saw so many back and forths in the chat about yelling and listening and so on and so forth. And I think that is probably one of the hardest things for police leaders as well as community leaders more generally, is to be willing to sit and be patient and listen and let people vent, and then use that as an opportunity for open and honest dialogue. And I think it doesn't have to be complicated. I think that these formal programs like YPI and those, they work exceptionally well because there's a process to go through. But in the end, I think it's just sitting down over a cup of coffee, over a beer, over a basketball game, over shooting pool, that allows people to see people as people and to see through uniforms, to see through baggy pants, to see through skin color, to see through and listen through language barriers and inflections and so on and so forth.
Well, you're really underscoring the relational piece that Susan was talking about, and the stunning comment that she made, it's not just crime reduction, but being invested in a community's success, whether it's the green spaces, a high school grad, or knowing a kid who was troublemaking at something like that. So it puts success in a hugely more robust context, and that whole piece. It's just fantastic. Was another question for Frank on this?
No, but there is a question about some of these programs being done in New York City and Tracy. Probably a lot, I would assume, right?
There are certain versions of it throughout. So, you know, specifically, what are they doing? I know that they are, when I say they, NYPD has definitely taken the lead on some really unique initiatives, but not just them, but throughout the state as well. So a lot of times you can go to the State Department of Public Safety and they'll be able to direct you. But there's a lot of work going on in multiple states that are doing this type of work on the ground.
Just back to your theme, Frank, about keeping it simple. I know in Camden, New Jersey, they're doing a lot around barbecues and basketball and mentoring, starting there. And the police, one cop I talked to there said, every minute I was thinking about retiring until we shifted, and now I just love this job. And I don't know whether that, I don't want to over-romanticize it because there's a huge transition going on the part of law enforcement, but I'm wondering whether you're seeing police who are now feeling a different attitude toward their work, or is it going both ways, saying this isn't normal policing, I'm bailing? How are you seeing this in terms of recruiting and retention? Anybody weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's going both ways. I think you need the leadership from the top. Somebody asked about mayors and councils. They need to be committed, and everybody has to realize that this isn't a miraculous event, that it takes time and sometimes years to work through issues that have in some cases taken decades to build. And if you're not committed to doing it in the long haul, it just doesn't get done. And I think in many departments there still is significant resistance amongst police officers, just like there's significant resistance among community members. And it really takes the commitment and dedication of a few brave souls, and I use the word brave, to be resolute and to be determined in working through these issues and building relationships.
And I want to add to that, if I could too. So it's not just that, it's also the impact this will have on recruiting officers of color. You don't have those relationships on the ground. It makes it very difficult for folks who want to see themselves in that position. And I think that, you know, as we think about not just building the trust with communities, we also have to think about what are those sort of one-offs that create, you know, actually compound the issues we're trying to deal with nationally.
Good point. Well, we're about the time to wrap up here. I would like to thank the three of you and Catherine, and this is so rich, and it really is vanguard stuff. and from resources to small programs to institutionalizing this, it's big. But to me, picking up a key motif here, it starts with a relational, and both sides willing to sit down and talk, whether it's over a cup of coffee. San Jose, there's a program where faith community is praying for officers, and they also take kids into the department, the roughest kids in the city, just to meet the officers who share with them their childhood, why they went into policing. So from the bottom relational up through the very complicated stuff, I really want to thank you all. And Catherine?
I just wanted to note one other resource on our website. Along with the task force report, we've done an implementation guide, and it's a real quick hit, 5 things law enforcement agencies can do, 5 things community groups can do. So if you want to get real practical, quick and easy hits to start making the change, I would direct your attention there.
Thank you, Catherine, so much for coming in.
Thank you, everybody. And this is Bass with DSG. We hope you've enjoyed a very informative and very constructive discussion. DSG will be putting on another webinar either at the end of February or beginning of March on the public health approach to violence. And so please be on the lookout for that. We'll be sending out an announcement shortly on that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Sure, I'd like to thank everyone that's participated and our presenters here today, and remind everyone that we do have a 5-minute evaluation. If we'd ask that you could please take that, and that is useful for our feedback and future training and planning purposes. Also wanted to remind everyone that this webinar will be posted in our online university. Will include a transcript, as many have asked about, so that will be posted in approximately 3 weeks. Again, the views and opinions expressed are not those that are necessarily reflected of OJJDP or the U.S. Department of Justice. One of our disclaimers. And if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to either OJJDP, NTTAC, or DSG. And our contact information with our website links are available. And again, here is our online evaluation. So we'd like to again thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you found this information very valuable. Thanks again.